Welcome to our final in the series of portraits of important Galicianers. And as we transition to Shmuel Yosef Agnon, we're looking at Galicia now beyond the Holocaust. As a Nobel laureate and almost universally regarded as the greatest Hebrew writer of the 20th century, we can only touch on his biography for this series ever so briefly. I'm mainly interested to consider his connection to Galicia and how he carried it with him. Shmuel Yosef Chachkes was born in Buchach, like Ringelblum, in eastern Galicia, a traditional middle-class Jewish home, the first of 5 children. He entered Cheder at age 3 as normal, but left at age 9 to study with private tutors, as well as his father, a fur merchant who was also an ordained rabbi and a follower of the Rebbe of Chortkov. Agnon divided his time between the Hasidic clois and the old Bes Midrash, or study house. Hasidism permeated his home, but they were also open to European culture. So besides deep Torah knowledge from his father, he grew interested in Haskalah and Hebrew and Yiddish, New Hebrew literature, European writing, learning German literature with his mother's help. Agnon started writing by age 8 in both Hebrew and Yiddish, publishing his first short works in 1903 at age 15. And he quickly gained a reputation in Galician literary circles, writing short stories and poems in Hebrew and Yiddish, rooted in that milieu, published in local journals like Hamitzpah and the Yiddische Wecker. In 1907, he moves to Lemberg Lvav, where he grows more integrated with Hebrew literary scene. Having earlier served as an assistant editor of a Yiddish weekly, he now co-edits a Hebrew journal with Gershom Bader, later, by the way, a very important source of knowledge on many Galician personalities. In 1908, attracted to Zionism, he made his way to Palestine, never writing in Yiddish again, although Yiddish appears overtly and covertly within his Hebrew writing. He was 20, but he took Buchach with him in his work for the rest of his life, like his character in A Simple Story from 1935. Although 40 years had passed since Dr. Langsam had left his birthplace, he writes, he still talked about it all the time. He returned physically only twice, for a week following his father's death in 1913 and for a 5-day visit in 1930. But from The City of the Dead, published in 1907, until The City and Its Fullness, published posthumously in 1973, Buchach and Galicia stayed with him forever. His first major publication in Palestine, Agnon, appears in October 1908 and established himself as a major writer, especially by his mentor, Yosef Chaim Brenner, which is also when he adopts the name Agnon. His stories were set in both the world he left and the new one he found, but were marked in particular by his encyclopedic mastery of classical Jewish sources, to an extent unmatched in modern Hebrew literature. In 1912, he publishes And the Crooked Shall Be Made Straight, which solidifies his status, particularly with Brenner, as one of the most important Hebrew writers of the day. That year he left for Germany, and he stays there through the war, not returning to Palestine in 1924. He was highly connected in Germany to major Jewish writers and thinkers then active, including Martin Buber and many others. And most of his stories in those years focused on Eastern Europe, particularly the world of Galicia that he knew best. Tragically, a long epic he was writing on Jewish life in Galicia, In the Bond of Life, was destroyed along with the rest of his library and manuscripts when his house burned down in 1924, ending his German period. He spends the next 5 decades in Jerusalem, resuming the Orthodox lifestyle of his childhood, producing 5 novels, hundreds of stories, and several anthologies of classical Jewish texts. 3 of these novels, as well as many stories, were set in eastern Galicia. The Bridal Canopy in 1931 centers on the adventures of Reb Udal Chassid, a pious Jew of the early 19th century who represents pre-modern Jewish society. A Simple Story in 1935, a realistic novel set at the fin de siècle, presents Buchach as a town of shopkeepers, depicting the divide in the life of a small-town bourgeois Jewish family torn between tradition and modernity. And the quote we have here gives you a sense of how he's depicting that lifestyle. Like other boys from well-to-do homes, he writes, who had studied to be rabbis and stopped, Herschel, the main character, joins the Society of Zion. The society owned a large room to which its members came to read newspapers and journals, or else to play chess on a board that stood on a table in a corner. Not all of the newspapers and journals dealt with Zionism, nor was everyone who read them a Zionist. There were some who came to the clubhouse simply to read, just as there were others who came to socialize. For one way or another, it was never a dull place. Zionism was less about ideological purity and political goals, to put it mildly, and very often about bourgeois boredom and privilege. His third novel, A Guest for the Night, 1939, was considered by the Nobel Committee to be his greatest. Inspired by his visit to Buchach in 1930, describes a year-long visit of the narrator, sort of himself, to Buchach, decimated by the ravages of World War I. It was about the disintegration of that world, and the town was called, as you can see here, Shibush, which is a play on words because that root means to spoil in Hebrew. As you see on the left, every place was changed, even the spaces between the houses. Nothing was as I had seen it when I was little, nor as it had been shown to me in a dream shortly before my return. But the odor of Shibush had not yet evaporated, the odor of the millet boiled in honey, which never leaves the town from the day after Passover until the end of November, when the snow falls, covering all. This theme of the disintegration of the world that was is not uncommon in his story set in Buchach, a kind of macabre version of Shalom Aleicham's shtetl dying from modernization. His work is often focused on the traumatic tension between tradition and modernity, with Buchach and Jerusalem often serving as focal points. The largest and most ambitious of his post-war publications on Buchach was certainly A City and Its Fullness, published in 1973, 3 years after his death, a massive work that includes folk tales, legends, chronicles, and other forms of narrative portraying Buchach. It was the author's effort to preserve for posterity the culture and people of a world destroyed. Unlike many of the earlier novels and stories, it was not based on memory. Actually, it was set in from between 1648, the time of the Chmielnicki uprising, through 1867, when Jewish emancipation and the rise of modern Jewish politics transforms the province. I am building a city, Buchach, he explained in 1956, but he was building, not rebuilding, building through his modernist lens. As scholar Alan Mintz put it, this is Agnon's great presumption, to fashion memories of life beyond the range of memory and to bring back a vanished world through the power of modern writing. Incidentally, I recommend strongly a new translation and commentary produced by Alan Mintz just before his passing. It's well worth the time of anyone interested in the history of Jewish Galicia before its destruction. I'll note here as well that Omer Bartov has a magisterial recent book on the history of Buchach, which also draws on Agnon. What he wrote here was not a Yizkor book. There was a genre of some 1,000 memory books produced after the war, in the decades after the war, by survivors, remembering the town in which they lived, including one for Buchach, to which he contributed a little bit. Rather, he didn't want to create a gravestone to memorialize a dead place, which is what the Yizkor books essentially did. He wanted to recreate the spiritual vitality it once possessed through storytelling. So he dealt with the Holocaust by avoiding it, at least directly. It was a response to the Holocaust in its own way to recreate this spirituality. And it's one that follows, an approach that follows traditional Jewish responses to national catastrophes. For example, following the destruction of the temples or the massacres or explosions in the Middle Ages, the emphasis of Jewish culture was on, quote, reconstructing the paradigms of meaning that had been broken by the calamities, as Mintz put it. Agnon twice received the Israel Prize in 1954 and 58, and the Nobel Prize in 66. His stories and novels about Buchach remain a vital source on the history of that town and on Galicia, but must be read carefully as literary constructions, refractions of his memories presented through his literary style. Nevertheless, through Agnon, Galicia lives on beyond its destruction, and that is a far happier thought with which to end our series. Thank you for joining us.